The penthouse ballroom was a shimmering cage of gold and glass, where the air tasted of vintage champagne and the sharp metallic tang of cold ambition. Every guest was armored in designer silk and inherited diamonds, their smiles as polished as the marble floors beneath their feet. Everyone except Aveline Korr. She stood at the edge of the glittering crowd, her white-knuckled hands clutching a cleaning cloth against her crisp Navy maid's uniform like a lifeline. To the social sharks circling the room, she was a nobody, a shadow in a room full of stars. But Aveline wasn't there by accident. She was working undercover to help a friend, unaware that her secret fiancé, Jaevo Kwon, was watching her every move through the building's high-definition security feed. Penelope Vanderbilt didn't just notice her, she smelled blood. Penelope had owned half the skyline for generations and viewed the working class as an amusing inconvenience to be toyed with. With a cruel, practiced smirk, she brushed past Aveline in a blur of silk. It was a move so fast and intentional that no one saw Penelope's hand slip a $100,000 diamond watch into the maid's apron. The music of the string quartet didn't stop, but the warmth in the room died as Penelope suddenly gasped, clutching her bare wrist. "My watch! It's gone!" Penelope's voice was a whip crack that silenced the room. She didn't look at the floor. She pointed a diamond-encrusted finger directly at Aveline's chest. "She was the only one near me. Check her pockets." The room went quiet for half a second, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide, and then the laughter came, jagged and merciless. Aveline didn't scream. She just stood frozen, her arms crossed in a defensive posture of utter shame as Penelope reached out and pulled the shimmering watch from Aveline's own pocket. Aveline's eyes blurred with the hot, stinging tears of a woman who had nowhere to run, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized the elite were ready to feed. That was when the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom didn't just open, they surrendered. The sound of a single pair of footsteps echoed against the marble like gunshots in a cathedral. The laughter vanished, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread that gripped every billionaire in the room. Because the man walking toward the center of the circle wasn't a guest, and he wasn't there for the party. He was the last man in the city anyone should ever dare to humiliate the fiancé of. Stay with me until the end because what Jaevo Kwon did in the next 60 seconds didn't just restore Aveline's honor, it systematically erased the Vanderbilt name from Manhattan's elite forever. Before we witness the most satisfying power reversal of the year, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments, what would you do if you were in Aveline's shoes? Now, let's get started. Aveline Korr never imagined that a planted watch would lead to the moment the king of the underground finally stepped out of the shadows for her. Aveline Korr moved through the penthouse like a ghost haunting a museum of things she could never own, her eyes cast downward to avoid the sharp, judgmental stares of Manhattan's elite. Her hands, rough from the chemical sting of industrial cleaners, were a jarring contrast to the soft, unblemished skin of the women she served, women whose only labor was the weight of the diamonds hanging from their ears. To these people, she was less a human being and more a piece of moving furniture, a silent background actor in their choreographed lives of inherited luxury. She had spent years mastering the art of invisibility, learning to tuck her head low and smooth the fabric of her navy and white uniform until she blended perfectly into the marble and gold leaf. As she circulated the ballroom with a silver tray of hors d'oeuvres, Aveline felt the suffocating pressure of the bubble. It was a world where power was measured in country club memberships and family legacies that stretched back centuries. She listened to them talk, conversations about offshore accounts, summering in the Hamptons, and the amusing inconvenience of the working class, and she realized they saw her only as a target for their boredom. She was the only black woman in a sea of silver hair and silk fans, and she felt the weight of their collective gaze like a physical heat on her skin. Every time Aveline caught a glimpse of her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows, she reminded herself why she endured it. She thought of the quiet safety of the life she was building, and the man who waited for her at the end of every shift. While she knew Jaevo Kwon didn't belong to this world of inherited wealth and didn't measure worth by the label on a dress, they had kept their engagement a secret to protect her from the shadows of his business. She was working this shift undercover, helping a friend who was too ill to show up. A small act of kindness she insisted on, despite Jaevo's warnings that these people could sense weakness like sharks smell blood in the water. But here, surrounded by women like Penelope Vanderbilt, Aveline was forced to swallow her pride and accept their casual cruelties as part of the job. She had just finished polishing a streak off a crystal flute when the atmosphere in the room shifted. Penelope Vanderbilt, wearing a gown that cost more than Aveline's yearly salary, began to drift toward her with a predatory glint in her eyes. The social sharks were sensing an opportunity, and Aveline knew from the way they whispered behind their flutes that the target was firmly on her back. She tried to slip back into the shadows, to become invisible once more, but the bubble of wealth was closing in. She clutched her cleaning cloth like a lifeline, her heart hammering against her ribs, unaware that Jaevo was already watching the live security feed from his car, counting down the seconds until he could tear this world apart. Penelope Vanderbilt noticed her first, her eyes sharp as glass and her smile a thin, dangerous line. Penelope had owned half of the city's skyline for generations, and she treated anyone outside her social circle, especially those she deemed below her social station, as an amusing inconvenience. "Darling, look at that poor thing by the buffet," Penelope whispered to her friend, her voice projected just enough for the surrounding guests to catch the scent of blood. Aveline tried to blend into the shadows, focusing on the silver tray in her hands, but the social sharks were already circling, sensing weakness in the water. "I suppose even the catering staff usually dress better than that." Penelope's friend Sarah giggled behind a crystal flute, her eyes scanning Aveline's simple navy and white uniform. The whispers followed Aveline like shadows, growing bolder with every step she took. The guests measured power by board positions and country club memberships, and to them, a black woman in a maid's uniform was a target they had paid $10,000 a plate to entertain. Aveline heard every word. Her cheeks burned with a deep, searing embarrassment, but she kept her eyes fixed on the floor. She had learned long ago that reacting only made the sharks more aggressive. "Does she even belong here?" Someone snickered, loud enough to cause a ripple of laughter in the immediate circle. "I heard the help is getting bolder these days. Look how she's clutching that cloth, like someone is going to steal it from her." The irony was a bitter weight in Aveline's chest, for these people had no idea who stood behind the woman they were mocking. They saw a nobody from the outer boroughs, but they missed the invisible thread that connected her to a man who was truly untouchable. Penelope Vanderbilt lived in a bubble of manufactured importance, completely unaware that she was playing a game with rules she didn't comprehend. She didn't notice the way the room seemed to chill as she stepped closer to Aveline, her movements calculated and predatory. "Maybe we should check if she's actually here to work," Penelope mused, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "or if she's just looking for a souvenir from the Vanderbilt collection." Aveline felt the suffocating pressure of their collective judgment, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized that being invisible was no longer an option. What Penelope didn't realize was that her target wasn't just a random maid, but a woman Jaevo Kwon had sworn to protect. While Aveline had insisted on working this shift to help a friend in need, the social sharks were about to realize they had cornered the one person in Manhattan they should never have touched. The transition from whispers to action happened with the terrifying speed of a predatory strike. Penelope Vanderbilt moved through the crowd with a blur of silk, her expensive gown rustling like a warning as she brushed past Aveline. It was a movement so fast and so intentional that no one in the room saw Penelope's hand slip into Aveline's navy apron. The music of the string quartet continued to play, but the warmth in the ballroom died as Penelope suddenly gasped, clutching her bare wrist with a look of manufactured horror. "My watch! My $100,000 diamond watch is gone!" Penelope's voice was a whip crack that silenced the room and caused the music to falter mid-note. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the air out of Aveline's lungs. Penelope didn't look at the floor. She didn't search the table. She pointed a diamond-encrusted finger directly at Aveline's chest, her eyes blazing with cruel triumph. "I knew it," Penelope sneered, holding the jewelry up like a trophy, while the crowd erupted into a jagged symphony of laughter and disgust. Aveline didn't scream or argue. The shock was too deep, the humiliation too absolute. She just lowered her eyes, her shoulders hunching in a self-protective, defensive posture as the tears began to blur her vision. "I didn't take it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the snickers of women who had paid $10,000 a plate to watch her be destroyed. The social elite leaned in, their faces masks of cruel smugness and superiority. To them, Aveline wasn't a person, she was a thief caught in the act, a nobody whose life was about to be ended for their amusement. Someone intentionally bumped into her hard, forcing her to stumble back into the pool of a previously shattered wineglass. As the red liquid soaked into her shoes and the laughter grew louder, Aveline felt utterly exposed and helpless. She didn't know that Jaevo, having watched the entire setup on the live feed from his car, had already slammed his door shut and was walking through the hotel's marble corridors with a lethal, calculated intent. She only knew that she was drowning in a sea of strangers who saw her pain as their evening sport. The laughter in the ballroom was no longer just a sound, it was a physical weight, a suffocating wall of mockery that seemed to press the air out of Aveline's lungs. She stood trembling at the center of the elite circle, her arms wrapped tightly around herself in a desperate defensive posture, her eyes fixed on the floor as the socialites of Manhattan celebrated her public theft. Penelope Vanderbilt stood over her, waving the diamond watch like a trophy, her face a mask of cruel smugness, as she savored the absolute humiliation of the woman she considered a nobody. "Look at her," Penelope sneered, her voice dripping with artificial superiority. "Caught red-handed. I suppose she thought a maid's apron was the perfect place to hide a fortune." The guests leaned in, their pointing fingers forming a jagged ring of accusation around Aveline. "Does she even have a defense?" someone shouted over a snicker. "Or is she too busy rehearsing her apology to the police?" Aveline didn't scream or beg. She simply felt the hot, stinging tears of a woman who had nowhere to run, her heart hammering against her ribs as she prepared for the end of her life as she knew it. But what Penelope and her circle of social sharks failed to notice, what they were too blinded by their own arrogance to sense, was that they were no longer alone in their victory. Jaevo Kwon was not merely a businessman delayed by a phone call. He was a man who had spent the last 10 minutes watching the high-definition security feed from his car, witnessing the precise moment Penelope's hand had violated Aveline's apron. He didn't need to guess who had planted the watch. He had already backed up the digital evidence to an off-site server before he even stepped out of his vehicle. That was when the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom didn't just open, they surrendered. The sound of a single pair of footsteps echoed against the marble like gunshots in a cathedral, each stride measured, deliberate, and radiating a lethal authority. The laughter vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread that gripped every billionaire in the room as they felt the temperature drop. The crowd parted like water before the bow of a ship as Jaevo Kwon moved through the room, his face stony and impassive, his eyes locked onto the shivering woman in the center of the circle. He didn't look at Penelope's pointing finger or the jewelry she held like a trophy. His stony eyes were locked onto Aveline, who stood shivering in her Navy maid's uniform, her arms still locked in a defensive posture of utter shame. The room was so silent that the only sound was the rustle of Jaevo's tailored Navy suit as he reached the center of the ring. Penelope Vanderbilt's hand began to tremble, the $100,000 watch catching the light of the chandeliers like a fallen star. She had seen Jaevo Kwon at business galas before, but she had never seen the king of the underground look at a servant with such lethal, controlled focus. To the absolute shock of every witness, the man who owned the very building they stood in did not demand an arrest. Instead, he stepped into the light, reached out, and took Aveline's rough, trembling hand in his own. The entire ballroom watched in a held breath as Jaevo Kwon, the most feared man in the city, lowered his head and brought the maid's hand to his lips. The soft brush of his kiss was a thunderclap in the silence, a public declaration that shattered every social hierarchy in the room. "I apologize for being late, my love," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room like a surgical blade. Penelope Vanderbilt's face went from smug triumph to the ashen white of a fresh grave as the realization hit her like a physical blow. She had just spent the last 10 minutes humiliating the one woman in Manhattan who was truly untouchable, completely unaware that Aveline was not just a maid, but the woman Jaevo had kept hidden in the shadows for her own safety. Jaevo straightened up, his hand still firmly anchoring Aveline to his side, shielding her from the stares that had just been mocking her. He turned his cold gaze toward the accusers, and for a moment, the fury shifted, becoming something infinitely more dangerous than raw anger. The trial was over. The execution of their reputations was about to begin. The silence in the penthouse was no longer the shocked quiet of a social scandal. It was the suffocating atmospheric pressure that preceded a lethal storm. Penelope Vanderbilt stood frozen, her fingers still curled around the diamond watch she had discovered in Aveline's pocket, but the trophy now felt like a lead weight, pulling her to an abyss. She looked at Jaevo Kwon, the man whose hand was still protectively anchored to Aveline's waist, and tried to find the words to reclaim her crumbling narrative. "Jaevo, you must understand. There's been a misunderstanding. This girl, she had the watch. I found it myself. These things happen with the help." She looked around the circle of socialites, seeking the support of the sharks who had been laughing moments before, but they were already backing away, sensing the predator in their midst. Jaevo's smile was winter itself, a cold, thin line that promised no mercy. He pulled his phone from his navy suit jacket with a casual precision that made the room tense with anticipation. "It's fascinating how people rely on their station to hide their crimes," said Jaevo, his voice level and conversational, yet vibrating with a lethal, controlled rage. "But you forgot one detail, Penelope. I don't just live in this building. I own the security firm that protects it." The blood drained from Penelope's face, leaving it as white as fresh snow. "This penthouse is equipped with the latest high-definition surveillance," Jaevo continued, his eyes locked onto hers with a surgical focus. "It records every movement, every whisper, and every desperate, pathetic act of sabotage." He tapped the screen of his phone, turning it so the light caught the display. "I've been watching the live feed for the last 10 minutes from my car," Jaevo revealed, correcting the room's assumption that he had just arrived blindly. "I watched you wait until Aveline was distracted. I watched you slip that watch into her apron with the practiced ease of a common thief." A gasp rippled through the ballroom as the guests realized the king of the underground had the digital receipts. Aveline looked up at Jaevo, the tears of shame in her eyes finally beginning to clear as she felt the weight of the humiliation dissolve. She wasn't the thief they wanted her to be. She was the fiancée of the man who held their entire world in his hands. "The footage is already being backed up to an off-site server," Jaevo said softly, his voice carrying through the absolute silence like a blade. "And since you were so concerned about the law, I imagine the authorities will find the audio of your accident quite illuminating." Penelope's confidence evaporated completely as she realized she wasn't just losing a social game, she was facing a total erasure of her life as she knew it. Jaevo Kwon did not raise his voice. He simply withdrew his phone with a cold, surgical precision that made the surrounding socialites recoil as if he were brandishing a weapon. The atmosphere in the penthouse had shifted from a courtroom to a slaughterhouse, and Jaevo was the one holding the blade. He ignored Penelope's stammered pleas, his gaze sweeping across the room and cataloging every face that had sneered at Aveline's distress. He dialed a number, the sound of the call connecting audible in the absolute suffocating silence of the ballroom. Marcus, Jaevo said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner where billionaires now stood in nervous clusters. I need you to pull the guest lists for tonight's event. Cross-reference every name with our business contracts, our venture capital holdings, and every outstanding debt record in the city. A wave of visible unease rippled through the crowd. Men who controlled global corporations suddenly found the floor fascinating, and women who had spent the night whispering behind silk fans now stood ashen-faced. They finally understood that Jaevo Kwon's influence wasn't just in the shadows, it was the very foundation upon which their own towers were built. I want to know every connection, every favor owed, and every permit pending, Jaevo continued, his hand still firmly anchored to Aveline to remind everyone exactly why this was happening. If they laughed, I want their credit lines frozen by morning. If they pointed a finger, I want their contracts terminated for breach of character. And, Marcus, start with the Vanderbilt portfolio. I believe their flagship construction project is currently sitting on land we hold the primary lien on. Penelope Vanderbilt let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as she realized her family's 3 generations of power were being dismantled with a 30-second phone call. Jaevo ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his stony and impassive expression never wavering. He looked at the room full of people who measured worth by bank balances, and for the first time, they saw the true cost of their cruelty. Aveline is my fiancée, Jaevo stated, the words hanging in the air like smoke after an explosion. And in my world, a debt against her is a debt against me. I suggest you all spend the rest of the evening considering how you intend to pay it. Aveline felt the steady, powerful warmth of Jaevo's hand against her back, and she no longer felt the need to lower her eyes. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was the reason their world was about to burn. The atmosphere in the penthouse didn't just chill, it turned sub-zero as the social sharks who had spent the last hour tearing into Aveline's dignity now stood paralyzed. Their predatory instincts were replaced by the frantic, panicked movements of the cornered as Penelope Vanderbilt's phone buzzed in her hand, a sharp, insistent vibration that sounded like a death knell in the silent ballroom. One by one, similar chimes and pings erupted across the room as the elite realized Jaevo Kwon's business evaluation was already a reality. "My cards are declined," a prominent investment banker whispered, staring at his screen in disbelief. "Every offshore account locked." The murmur of terror grew into a desperate chorus as the guests realized their inherited security had evaporated with a single command from the man standing at the center of the room. Jaevo didn't look at them. His gaze remained on Aveline, whose defensive posture was slowly relaxing as she felt the shift in the room's power. "Words are cheap, Penelope," Jaevo said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the frantic whispers. "You were very vocal when you thought Aveline was a nobody. I want to hear that same voice now." Penelope's pride fought a losing battle with her survival instinct. She looked at Aveline, the woman she had just called a thief, and saw not a maid, but the person who now held the keys to the Vanderbilt empire. With trembling knees, Penelope stepped forward, the diamond watch she had planted now a heavy, glittering symbol of her own downfall. I apologize," Penelope choked out, the words seeming to physically pain her as they left her throat. "I lied. I planted the watch. It was a cruel, desperate act, and I am deeply ashamed." Around her, the other guests followed suit, driven by a primal fear of the man who could erase their lives with a phone call. Dr. Holbrook, the surgeon who had mocked Aveline's dress, bowed her head in genuine terror. The judge's wife, who had laughed the loudest, was now sobbing as she begged for forgiveness. One by one, the elites of Manhattan were forced to acknowledge the humanity they had so easily discarded. Aveline watched them, her eyes clear of tears for the first time all evening. She felt Jaevo's hand squeeze hers, a steady, grounding presence that reminded her she was no longer alone. She didn't feel the need to be gracious or to smooth over their discomfort. Instead, she simply nodded, accepting their forced penance, not as a favor, but as a debt finally being paid in full. The room was full of billionaires, but as they stood there begging for their lives, it was clear who the truly powerful person was. The heavy silence of the penthouse was broken by the distant, rhythmic wailing of sirens, a sound that signaled the final collapse of Penelope Vanderbilt's gilded world. Jaevo Kwon didn't wait for the doors to burst open. He turned his back on the ashen-faced socialites, his hand still firmly anchored to Aveline's waist as he guided her through the parting crowd. The elite of Manhattan watched them go with a mixture of terror and envy, realizing too late that the woman they had treated as an amusing inconvenience was the only person in the room who truly belonged to the man who controlled their fates. As they stepped into the private elevator, the suffocating pressure of the ballroom began to dissolve, replaced by the cool, quiet luxury of Jaevo's world. They reached the street level just as a fleet of black sedans pulled to the curb, their engines humming like a low-frequency warning to the city. Jaevo's driver opened the door to the lead car, and as they settled into the deep leather seats, Aveline finally let out the breath she had been holding since the first accusation was thrown. The city passed by outside the tinted windows, a blur of neon and steel, but inside the car, the air was still thick with the aftermath of Jaevo's controlled rage. Aveline looked at her hands, still clean of the shame the accusers had tried to stain her with, and then looked at Jaevo. His stony expression had softened, but the cold light in his eyes remained. "It's not over, is it?" she asked softly. Jaevo reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim, encrypted drive. "An apology is a start, but it doesn't change their nature," he said, his voice a quiet rumble against the hum of the sedan. "Penelope Vanderbilt and her circle didn't just target you because they thought you were weak. They did it because they believed their wealth made them untouchable." He tapped the drive against his palm, revealing that Marcus hadn't just found business contracts, but 10 years of systematic tax fraud, offshore money laundering, and charity embezzlement tied to every person who had pointed a finger at her that night. Aveline watched as he sent a final command from his phone. "The authorities are entering the ballroom now," Jaevo continued, his smile as sharp as winter. "By the time the sun rises, the Vanderbilt name won't be on a skyscraper, it will be on a federal indictment." He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her skin with a tenderness that no one in that ballroom would have believed him capable of. Aveline leaned her head against his shoulder, the trauma of the evening finally receding into a sense of absolute justice. She had entered the penthouse as an invisible ghost, but she was leaving it as the protected heart of the city's most powerful man. As the black sedan vanished into the shadows of Manhattan, Aveline Korr realized that while kindness costs nothing, the price of cruelty was finally being paid in full.